This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I was very daunted when I was asked to come and speak here to a group of philosophers and neurologists, because in fact I've always been, since I dropped out of medicine, I've always been an amateur of this field, and there are things in which I've continued to interest myself, and ever since I was really acquainted with visual research by being supervised by Horace Barlow at Cambridge when I was a young man, and it was always a very important part of my life, and by that whole group of Cambridge neuroscientists who were experts on vision, but particularly Horace. I think Horace had a great influence on me and directed my eyes towards the subject of eyes and the gaze and so on and so forth. And in order to talk a little bit about visual paradoxes, I want to start by saying that I've been acquainted with one particular sort of paradox which I think very few of you will have been acquainted with in the way that I have been, although I think probably by simply being members of an audience you will have been acquainted with it, and that is the curious unmentioned and undescribed paradox of theatrical performance. Now, theatrical performance involves a visual paradox which people are not really conscious of, and you have to draw their attention to this duplex vision which the audience engages in when they are watching a play. Because what they are watching is what John Austin has talked about in his great essay on pretending. You are watching people pretending to be someone who they're not, and the audience is constantly oscillating backwards and forwards visually between two visual experiences. One is the experience of watching someone who they know, usually a famous actor who they have come to see perform, and then they are also watching that actor pretending to be someone who doesn't exist. And I think Bernard Williams once wrote a rather brilliant essay on this and actually drew people's attention to it by saying, I'm seated in the third row of the National Theatre. I am 18 feet from Sir Laurence Olivier. I find it very hard to say how many feet I am from Othello. And I think that this is a problem, and it's an interesting problem, which you watch audiences, when I don't sometimes in my own production stand in the wings and watch audiences, and watch them oscillating backwards and forwards between a gaze which is directed under one description at a person who is a performer, who is pretending to be someone, and a moment later their gaze changes and their facial expression changes when they're actually watching someone who this famous person who's actually going off stage and continuing to be Sir Laurence Olivier is in fact doesn't exist at all. In other words, Othello, a fictional character. So that I've always been acquainted with this rather curious, unmentioned visual paradox of duplex vision, which is involved in being a member of an audience. Now, what I told Colin I would do is that I would address myself to the title of my talk, which is On the Move, but also I will start by addressing myself to another visual paradox area, which is reflection. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about reflection and some of the paradoxes involved in that, and then some of the paradoxes and the illusions which are involved in the representation of movement. And this gentleman is very kindly going to take my cues in order to deal with the computer representation of what's on the screen there. My wife has been helping me to do this because I'm completely inept at these sort of technical things. Okay, so do forgive me for reading, but I have to read because I tend to forget what I'm saying. So, we'll start on reflection. Well, some years ago, I was struck by the behavior of our cat on the edge of the pavement in front of our house. An hour or so earlier, a downpour of rain had left deep puddles in the gutter. Normally the cat would have hurried across the street without pausing to consider or take account of the supportiveness of the ground underfoot. But now she sat hesitantly on the side of the curb, apparently disconcerted. From time to time she cautiously dabbled her paw in the otherwise invisible surface of the water and fastidiously shook off the droplets. After a while she crept along the pavement to a point where the gutter was dry. There she scuttled across the road. Evidently pawing the puddle had confirmed her reluctance to entrust her full weight to such a paradoxical surface. What had prompted her to test the puddle so cautiously? Something about the appearance of its questionable surface enabled her to distinguish it from the safely supportive surface of the brickwork on all sides. What could that have been? Well, one answer might be that in contrast to the matte surface of the dry ground around, the puddle was disconcertingly reflective. But what exactly does that mean? In what way does a reflective surface disclose itself as something fundamentally and disconcertingly different from the unreflective surface which surrounds it? The problem is that unless it's ruffled by the wind into a pattern of noticeable ripples, the surface of a puddle or a pond, like that of a flawless mirror, is more or less invisible. And this is a Kai-box picture in which the surface betrays itself by the ripples on the surface, which takes and it reminds you that you are in fact looking at something where those ripples are on the surface. And in anyone who goes and watches a motionless virtual surface which is invisible might be very disconcerted by what they see, because they see nothing but a reflection. But those wonderfully reassuring ripples actually remind you of something which is on the surface rather than below it or reflecting something else. So, though not quite, pools of motionless water, like mirrors, afford the observer a view. But in contrast to the actual view to be seen through a window, say, or an open door, or indeed straight ahead, this view is virtual. Things are not where they seem to be. Looking at the puddle from the opposite side of the street, I could see what I knew to be the reflected image of the cloudy sky above. I doubt if the cat saw it as such, or that she was disconcerted by seeing clouds and foliage where they had no business to be. Still, she must have experienced the puddle as something fundamentally different from the surrounding dry ground, and although she may not have recognized what she saw, and it was a paradoxically displaced sky, let alone the submerged image of another cat looking at her from the lower depths, right? And she certainly didn't suspect it was actually herself. I suspect she did see something at a disconcerting depth below the otherwise invisible surface of the puddle. In other words, the cat reacted to the virtual view of the sky above as if it were the actual view of the dangerous depth below. As James Gibson has repeatedly pointed out, one of the most important functions of the visual system is to represent the affordedness, the supportiveness of the ground underfoot, and the ability to distinguish it from yielding watery surfaces, which protect the terrestrial mammal from the risk of drowning. Well, in the natural conditions under which the visual system has evolved, horizontal sheets of still water would have been the only surface whose enigmatic reflectiveness represented an interpretive challenge. In nature, there are no vertical surfaces which offer comparably deceptive views of the world beyond. So the invention of artificially reflective materials complicated the scene considerably. And although human beings have adjusted themselves to a world which includes mirrors and transparent windows through which you see, though it's hard to penetrate, it's easy to underestimate the cognitive problems created by surfaces which are reflective enough to provide misleading views. As we know, it takes some time for a human infant to recognize the differences between what it sees in a mirror and what it sees through an open doorway or indeed a transparent window. The reflected image which he or she sees in a mirror is not recognizable until she is able to discover a way of testing its peculiar representational relationship to her own presence. And this is my eldest granddaughter, who first came into our bedroom one day wearing a scarf and suddenly confronted herself in the mirror and was disconcerted by the appearance of someone on the other side of something through which she couldn't go. She spent a long time looking at it, then went away, took that striped scarf off in the other part of our bedroom, came back and saw that the creature who had once been there with the scarf was no longer in the scarf and she suddenly realized she was looking at herself, because nothing had taken off its scarf except for her. Good. So the surfaces which afford the experience of seeing oneself in a mirror are ideally invisible, and in some cases they can be confused with the equally impenetrable glass surface of a window through which we can see to an actual beyond, and we can occasionally mistake one for the other. And the ability to identify one's own reflection can often play a crucial part in recognizing a mirror as such. Here's an example. Some years ago I visited a palazzo in Ferrara. I entered the vestibule and stood at the bottom of a grand staircase, on the first landing of which I saw what seemed to be a framed doorway leading to the back of the house. As I mounted the staircase, I was surprised suddenly to see my own image approaching in what I immediately understood to be the surface of an equally large mirror. What I had taken to be the framed entrance of a corridor leading ahead of me turned out to be the reflection of the vestibule behind me. To all intents and purposes, my seeing it as a rear view depended on recognizing it as a reflection, which I only did as a result of having seen myself reflected in it, because I was now old enough to recognize myself coming into the mirror. Well, as soon as I recognized it as a mirror, I became aware of other telltale signs which ought to have been visible from the outset as I came up the staircase. And when I retraced my steps and stood again at the bottom of the stairs, I was surprised to discover that I could see, after all, what I had previously overlooked, the blemishes and dust on the otherwise invisible surface of the glass, and now the unmistakable gleam of its beveled edge, which betrayed the fact that it was in fact a glass mirror. Any one of these clues would have been enough to give the game away, and yet, for some reason, I had failed to notice them until the appearance of my reflected image told me that I was looking in a mirror. We can keep that there for the moment. Well, under normal circumstances, mirrors betray themselves as such without the assurance of a personal reflection, just as they do in paintings, where for obvious reasons we are denied the opportunity of seeing ourselves reflected. But in contrast to a sheet of plate glass, which we can painfully collide without any advance warning, it's impossible to get that close to a mirror without meeting yourself coming in the opposite direction. It is this encounter, of course, that Lewis Carroll leaves so artfully undescribed when he smuggles his heroine from her own room into its reflected counterpart on the far side of the mirror. There we are. Alice, you'll remember, amuses herself by entertaining the idea that the reflected room is an actual one, and that by pretending that the glass is conveniently softened enough to let her through, she can visit what she calls the looking glass world. What Carroll conveniently forgets to mention is the indescribable schmozzle that would have occurred as soon as the real Alice collided with her reflected self coming in the opposite direction. In fact, considering how observant Lewis Carroll allows her to be about all the other contents of the looking glass room, it's decidedly odd that she fails to notice that the room in question is occupied by someone who looks and acts exactly like herself. Apart from the fact that the two individuals in question are gazing in opposite directions, one apparently looking at the other. This is quite unlike the paradoxical state of affairs represented in, of course, Magritte's famous picture, in which we never see ourselves from the back, we always see someone looking at us from the front. And go back to the Alice picture again. Thank you very much. Well, are we to assume that Alice thinks the reflected Alice is as actual as the reflected room? If the reflected room was sufficiently actual to allow the real Alice to visit it, she would have had no reason to believe that the reflected occupant is any less actual. If both Alices are actual, how are we meant to visualize their collision? It's all very well to pretend that the otherwise impenetrable glass which separates them can soften, but that won't do when it comes to getting through each other, because if one Alice politely dissolves in deference to her mirror image, the courtesy will be symmetrically reciprocated, leaving no Alices whatsoever. In order to be sure that his story can continue, Carroll has to gloss over the difficulties in reconciling reconciling the apparent actuality of the reflected room and the self-evident virtuality of her appearance in it. Until she caught sight of her reflected self, she could sustain the admittedly pretended belief that the room she could see on the far side of the chimney was just as real as the one on the near side. But this illusion would have been shattered as soon as she saw herself, because in contrast to everything else shown in the mirror, which could after all have been a reverse duplicate of the real room, Alice had incontrovertible first-person knowledge of where she, the one and only Alice, was actually standing. And unless she made the deeply counterintuitive assumption that the looking-glass world included a continuously updated replica of herself, she would be bound to recognize that the other Alice was a virtual image of her own actual presence on the near side of the mirror. And in conceding that, she would have had to concede that the looking-glass world itself was just as virtual, and that the apparently distant wall beyond her own reflected image was none other than the one behind her own back, where the space where she was standing. Familiar though we are with the experience of seeing things, ourselves included in the mirror, there is still an undeniable sense that the experience is an illusion, since what we see, or rather where we see it, is not where it seems to be. But even when we recognize it as an illusion, the frequency with which we decorate our walls with mirrors is prompted by something more than the rather suspect opportunity of seeing ourselves represented. It also provides the intriguing illusion of an alternative world which might be visited if only we could, like Alice, go through the impenetrable looking glass into this elsewhere. Of course, there is an unarguable sense that in which pictures are another form of illusion, since, however true to life they appear to be, the spectator is simultaneously aware of the fact that what appears to be in 3 dimensions is actually a 2-dimensional format. It's interesting in this respect, thank you, it's interesting in this respect to consider the paradox of representing reflective surfaces in unreflective materials like paint, no matter how, as it were, reticent they are painted with such skill as they are in the 18th century. For example, in Desport's astonishingly realistic painting. The apparently mirrored surface, which so convincingly reflects the images of peaches in the foreground, disconcertingly fails to reflect the image of the viewer, or indeed of the 3-dimensional space in which he or she stands. No matter how close he comes to look at himself in the reflected mirror, in the painted mirror, he never sees himself. But then, of course, it is the painting of a reflective surface and not a real one. In fact, if we reframe the picture, masking off everything except the reflected images, thereby eliminating the actual peaches in the foreground, what we saw previously as a reflection becomes simply a picture of peaches. There we are. Good. And onward. In the picture we've just looked at, the reflectiveness of the silver surface makes itself apparent as such only by virtue of the visibility of what it seems to reflect. Whereas in Velázquez's picture in the National Gallery, it's rather hard to tell whether the framed representation of Jesus, Mary and Martha is a reflection of something at which the servants are evidently gazing out here, or the view of the same character seen through a transparent window which we are looking in the opposite direction. Is that a window, or is that a reflection of something which is happening here? I would say that judging by the engaged gaze of the servants in the foreground, that we must assume that what they're looking at is what is reflected, in which case that is a mirror, not something through which we're looking to a beyond. Well, I'd like to conclude this part of my talk with a well-known comic scene, which I won't even label, because you will know it. And here we go. I think we have to bring that on. We haven't got the sound, we just have the picture. So that's the end of my thing on reflection. So that's something I've always been fascinated by mirrors. In fact, I curated an exhibition at the National Gallery and I think that's the most marvellous sort of playful game of just testing the way we test whether something is a reflection of us or not. Now, I want to talk a little bit now about the representation of movement. Compared to the finesse and accuracy with which artists had already succeeded in representing the three-dimensional appearance of a motionless world, it wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that they succeeded in creating the convincing illusion of movement, apparent movement within that world. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to assume that actions and events were conspicuous by their absence in the pictorial arts of antiquity and afterwards. Static though they undoubtedly are, paintings and sculptures had already captured the configurations from which the spectator could at least infer both the previous position of the body and the limbs and the movement which would lead to their subsequent position, events which would have been self-evidently apparent in the real world. Convincing though many of these pictorial formats might have been, artists often failed to capture some of the more complicated aspects of locomotion, especially when it came to representing the details of four-legged movement of horses and so forth. Visitors to art galleries are now familiar with the unfamiliar and the unconvincing representations of the galloping horse, which I'll show a picture of in a minute. Although the invention of photography eventually provided the pictorial medium upon which the success of representing such complex movements was based, when it was first invented in 1839, the photosensitivity of the plates was so low that the lengthy exposures required precluded the photographic representation of anything on the move. In fact, the modern spectator is now familiar with the conspicuous absence of human beings in a vista in which the camera represented the sunlit details of midday Paris, in which no one can be seen on the streets at all. And that is characteristic of what happened when in fact you had to have such long exposures that you couldn't get people on the move. Those crowded streets were empty because they never left any trace on the photographic records. Well, it wasn't until several years later that the busy population of the streets began to make it somewhat blurred appearance, and even the possibility of capturing the successive stills upon which moving pictures are based was not yet an option. The paradox is that a few years before photography was invented, scientists had already invented pictorial devices upon which the illusion of apparent movement was based. In 1832, the Belgian physicist Joseph Plateau introduced what he called the phenakistoscope, in which a device which represented the viewer with a punctuated succession of static drawings, each of which represented an arrested moment in the otherwise continuous development of a natural movement. The figures were arranged, as you can see, around the circumference of a rotating disc, to be viewed through another disc in which there was a radial sequence of slits. If the rotation of the pictorial disc was viewed without that of the slitted disc just above it, the viewer saw nothing but a whizzing smear. But as long as the visibility of the pictorial disc was periodically interrupted by that of the slitted disc immediately above it, the streaming blur resolved itself, not altogether convincingly, into an uninterrupted sequence of continuous pictures, still pictures, which the viewer, nevertheless, perceived as an apparently continuous movement. Though when you actually run those phenakistoscopes, it's not a very, very convincing thing, because the actual interpolation of those slits doesn't quite work. Well, the stroboscope, independently devised by the Austrian mathematician Simon von Stampfer, was almost identical to Plateau's mechanism. In each of these devices, the illusion of movement was somewhat compromised by the distracting visibility of the rotations which brought the pictures one by one into view. And it wasn't until the 1870s that there was any noticeable attempt to overcome this difficulty. By this time, photography had developed to the point where the exposure time required to produce a convincing image had been dramatically shortened, thereby providing the as yet, and for a long time, unexploited possibility of snapping an intermittent succession of detailed still photographic images comparable to the drawn images that Plateau and Stumpfer had done. In 1876, however, the English barrister Wordsworth Donisthorpe suggested an arrangement in which the movement which delivered the successive images was effectively concealed, so that the static visibility of each one was confined to the brief moment when it was actually in view. This was to be achieved, apparently, by taking photographic prints of the rapidly successive exposures and fixing them one after another onto a long strip or ribbon. This strip was to be wound from one bobbin to another, so that the episodic photographs were made serially, one after another, visible at the same rate that they had been exposed. Now, although this device was never actually realized by Donisthorpe, with the benefit of hindsight, one can recognize the extent to which he had unwittingly anticipated the basic principles of the movie projector, in which the viewer is completely unaware of the movements which bring each of the pictures into view. In the modern projector, each picture, as we know, is brought into view under cover of darkness, held still for a moment before it is invisibly removed and equally invisibly replaced by its successor. This complicated process is now achieved by coordinating the intermittent advance of the sprocketed film with the alternating action of a rotating shutter, which conceals both the arrival and the departure of each frame. Mechanically, this arrangement is indistinguishable from the operation of a machine gun, where a succession of cartridges is intermittently brought into position, held still for just as long as it takes the firing pin to strike, after which it's moved on to be replaced by its successor. In other words, intermittent stable positions, punctuated by, in the case of the movie, by invisible moves from one to the other. Well, what you might ask, does the intermittent succession of almost identical pictures, why does it afford the illusion of continuous movement? The traditional explanation invokes, and it still goes on, people still invoke it, is the so-called persistence of vision, according to which there is a brief period after the removal of one picture when its after image persists upon the retina, allowing it to blend smoothly with its successor. Well, this theory, which seems to have originated from the experimental work of Michael Faraday and Peter Roget, not to mention that of Plateau himself and his colleagues, is repeated by modern theorists of the cinema who still seem to overlook the fact that if it were literally true, it would result in the overlapping of several still pictures on the same frame, comparable to Marcel Duchamp's nude descending the stairs. And that's not what we actually see. One can only assume that the illusion of continuous movement is due to something other than the persistence of retinal imagery. In any case, even if we accept the claim that visual images outlast the moment of their projection onto the retina, it would be a mistake to regard this, I think, and I defer to the experts here, as an explanation for the illusion of movement, for the simple reason that vision does not occur on the retina. We don't see what's going on the retina. The retina affords what is required to see whatever we see. Although it's difficult to say exactly where visual experience does take place, if indeed there is a particular somewhere, it's becoming increasingly apparent that what we see, movement or otherwise, is constructed by the visual system as a whole, and that, as Donald Hoffman insists, it's the expression of what he describes as visual intelligence. There were intimations of this constructive capability in the experiment which Sigmund Exner performed in 1875, when he briefly flashed a disk of bright light onto the left-hand side of the screen, and less than a second later he flashed a similar light onto the right-hand side. The observer, of course, as you all know, reported that instead of seeing two separate lights going on and off, one after the other, he saw one light moving rapidly from one side of the screen to the other. If, however, the interval, of course, as you all know, between the two lights was either too short or too long, or if the distance between them was somewhat exaggerated, the illusion would be lost. These results are conspicuously at odds with the traditional theory of the persistence of vision, because if the image on the left-hand side had visibly outlasted its extinction, the observer would have seen two lights, the first of which would have begun to fade away gradually. The apparent movement of one light moving from left to right, as opposed to two lights appearing one after the other, was self-evidently created or constructed by the observer by a cognitive process comparable to the one unknowingly exploited by Plato and Stampfer 40 years earlier. The versatility of this constructive process was revealed in a number of subsequent experiments. For example, in 1916, Vittorio Benussi discovered that if a visible obstruction was placed between the two lights, a black square, for example, the observer often reported that the apparent movement hopped over the obstruction in a curved line. Something, however, it seemed to move in front of or behind the obstructing square. It's interesting to consider how implicit knowledge determines what we actually see. For example, almost 100 years after these experiments, the Danish psychologist Gunnar Johansen put small lights, as everyone knows, onto the joints of actors dressed in black in a completely darkened room. Until the invisible actor moved, the observer reported nothing more than a meaningless constellation of motionless lights. But as soon as the otherwise invisible actor began to move, the observer recognized what he or she was looking at and could usually identify not only what particular action was being performed, but often the gender of the performer. But let's go back 100 years or so and consider the achievements of the English photographer Edward Muybridge. That's a name which he acquired when he went to the United States. He was actually called Edward Muggeridge and born in Kingston, where he lived. I thought it might make it more glamorous to have this Edward Muybridge. After migrating to America in 1852, he worked for several years as a successful bookseller on the East Coast. He returned to England in the 1860s, having just recovered from a nearly fatal stagecoach accident in which he'd lost consciousness. Well, during his lengthy convalescence, he devoted himself to the study of photography, and when he returned to the United States, he established himself as one of the most accomplished and valued landscape photographers on the West Coast. Despite the fact that human beings and animals were conspicuous by their absence from his picturesque vistas, not because it was too slow, but simply because he wasn't interested in there being anything other than landscape, his photographic skill attracted the attention of the former governor of California, Leland Stanford. Like many of his sporting colleagues, Stanford was apparently preoccupied with the controversial claim that there was a moment during its rapid trot when the horse had all 4 feet off the ground. We don't want to be off on this, not yet. In the hope that high-speed photography might capture this otherwise elusive moment, Stanford invited Muybridge to apply his photographic skills to the problem. He was predictably flattered by this aristocratic request, and although there was nothing to indicate that he was particularly interested in locomotion as such, and indeed, the more you look at these things, you can see that actually locomotion was of no interest to him whatsoever. In fact, although he subsequently won fame and fortune by publishing nearly 1,000 photographs of animals and human beings on the move, he never expressed any particular interest in the scientific problems of vertebrate locomotion. He never talked about it, he never tried to explain it. He was really totally uninterested in the mechanics of it. He was only interested in recording it. He was simply intrigued by the technical problem of picturing events too rapid to be seen with the naked eye. He recognized that what Stanford required could only be achieved if a number of conditions were satisfied. First, the photosensitivity of each plate had to be such that it could record an unambiguous image of with an extremely short exposure. He also realized that there had to be some way of obtaining a punctuated succession of such images, one after another. This would mean that there had to be several cameras separated from one another by relatively short gaps. To begin with, the photographs turned out to be too indistinct to be publishable, but in the early summer of 1878, at almost the same moment that Sigmund Exner had demonstrated the apparent movement of two spots of light, Muybridge was able to introduce necessary improvements. With the professional help of Stanford's mechanics and electricians, he set up a row of 12 high-speed cameras, the number of which was doubled in the following year, with intervals between them having been more or less halved, so that they were lying parallel to the racetrack. The cameras were activated by a set of tripwires serially arranged along the side of the racecourse, so that the horse itself was responsible for activating consecutive exposures as it trotted by. You see, and then get that position, and then another one. Now this mobilization had not yet achieved until many years later. Let's take the next picture. And then these are perhaps the most famous pictures, which is his early pictures of the galloping horse. And that obviously satisfied Stanford. Well, about 1881, a large number of these serial photographs had been published under the title The Attitudes of Animals in Motion. His achievement had already been recognized by Scientific American, and the French scientific journal La Nature had already published several reproductions of these photographs, prompting the distinguished French physiologist Etienne Jules Méret to get in touch with Muybridge in the belief that these undeniably truthful images would be much more informative than the drawing which had been used by Plateau and his colleague 50 years earlier. In fact, when Muybridge arrived in Paris as an international celebrity, he was invited by Méret to demonstrate not only his still pictures, but also the illusion of movement produced by projecting the succession of stills onto a screen from a significantly improved version of the stroboscope. And he was able to actually mobilize them in the way that we just saw briefly the mobilized movement. And at a party which he attended sometime later, Muybridge became acquainted with the famous artist Meissonier, who would shortly modify some of his equestrian pictures under the influence of Muybridge's striking animations. Well, in the course of his many lectures, which Muybridge gave both in France and in England, he repeatedly insisted that his photographic stills proved how inaccurate and misleading conventional illustrations of animal movement had all too frequently been, and that ever since antiquity, artists had consistently misrepresented the equestrian gallop or trot. He cited the many pictures in which the creature was shown in the so-called rocking horse position. Classical one there, 2 feet out to the back, 2 feet out to the front, never the alternation of the 2 front legs and the 2 back legs. And then the next one, please. And that one there, exactly the same, the rocking horse position. And the frequency to which this attitude was monotonously repeated gave it an undeserved reputation, as far as he was concerned, for truthfulness. And that when the spectators were confronted by the more complicated attitude seen in Muybridge's photographs, they usually concluded that it was the camera which had lied. Well, this was the moment at which Muybridge exploited what he called the zoepraxiscope, which was a vastly improved version of the zoetrope and the troboscope that had been introduced. That is the device. Well, by animating the rapid succession of seemingly untruthful stills, or said to be the untruthful stills, Muybridge was able to convince most of the skeptics that far from lying, the camera was the only reliable source of pictorial truth. If, as his critics repeatedly insisted, photographs were false, how was it that when animated under these zoepraxiscopes, they represented movement so convincingly in a way that the still pictures previously had not done. Well, by this time, Muybridge had developed an almost missionary zeal, and although he was disappointed by his repeated failure to obtain sponsorship for his ambitious project devoted to the relationship between photographic representation of movement and that of traditional art, a project for which he had hoped to get contributions from both Méret and Meissonier, on his return to the United States, he renewed his efforts by issuing a prospectus for the attitudes of man, horse, and other animals in motion. And in 1883, his luck suddenly changed when the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia invited him to pursue his investigations in a more systematic fashion. Apart from its long-standing scientific distinction, the University of Pennsylvania was extremely wealthy. But the most significant fact was the presence of two men who had already expressed an informed interest in Muybridge's early work in Palo Alto. Fairman Rogers was the head of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and an extremely prosperous sportsman whose interest in the subject was almost the same as that of Muybridge's original sponsor, Stanford. Thomas Eakins, on the other hand, was a most accomplished painter and a photographer. Both men were eager to recruit Muybridge, and after extensive negotiations with the academic establishment, funds were promised on the understanding that Muybridge was to be supported in his work by physicists, anatomists, and engineers. And he was able, with their help, in addition to affording having three separate batteries of cameras arranged at various angles to one another, he therefore afforded foreshortened and oblique views in addition to the conventional row of cameras parallel to the lines of action. He started with human subjects, but having moved his equipment to the zoological gardens, he now turned his attention to the aerial movement of birds. Until recently, this archive was widely regarded as the scientific basis for human locomotion. And there is the picture of Muybridge himself, stark naked in Philadelphia, recording himself in movement. There's another one here coming up as well. These are other movements, but as Martha Brown was the first to point out, the extent to which this pictorial compendium should be regarded as anything equivalent to, what I'm going to talk about in a minute, Etienne Jules Méret's enterprise is questionable. Quite apart from the fact that close examination of all these assemblages, of which we've seen one or two here, shows how much Muybridge fiddled with them, and that when, for one reason or another, individual frames were either missing or blurred, he was quite prepared to replace them with a duplicate of the previous frame, or even from frames taken from totally different sessions altogether. And when Muybridge addressed himself to female movement, the sequences are distractingly picturesque, condescendingly domestic, and in some case teetering on the edge of soft porn. And they get worse and worse under that heading. So, Méret. Until Stanford encouraged him to read Méret's recently published work on animal locomotion, it's unlikely that Muybridge would have known anything about his distinguished French counterpart. In fact, as I've already pointed out, there's nothing to indicate that the English photographer had any interest whatsoever in the deep structures and processes which coordinated animal locomotion and what, in fact, the neurological basis of locomotion was. Whereas by 1874, when Stanford and Muybridge first took note of him, Etienne Jules Méret had already earned an impressive reputation for his purely scientific papers on the subject of animal movement. As a schoolboy, Méret had already shown a remarkable talent for making mechanical toys, and if his father hadn't insisted on his studying to become a doctor, he would almost certainly have followed his own inclinations and applied for a place in the École Polytechnique. And the chances are that his achievements as a civil engineer would have been just as impressive and distinguished as the ones for which he is now celebrated. But it's not as if his originality was stifled by the biological training he'd been forced to undertake by his father. On the contrary, by the time he entered medical school in 1849, the subject of experimental physiology was beginning to flourish in France, particularly in Paris, and it immediately aroused Méret's scientific interest. As a radical materialist, he was convinced that both the external movements of the limbs and the invisible actions of the internal organs were closely related to that of engines and of machines, and that the so-called vital principle, which would continue to excite the interest of so many physiologists until the first decade of the 20th century, had nothing to do with the case. In fact, it's interesting to compare, I think, Méret's experimental interests and his preoccupations with the mechanics with the theoretical preoccupations of his 18th century predecessor, La Mettrie, who also regarded human beings as, and indeed all animals, as nothing other than machines. When he was still an intern, Méret had begun to publish on what he referred to as the hydraulics of circulation. And by 1860, he devised an astonishingly subtle instrument for recording the continuous variations of the pulse. By this time, he'd given up whatever ambitions he might have had to become a clinical practitioner, and until 1867, he addressed himself exclusively to the internal movements of the living body, the contractions of the heart, the pressure variations in blood vessels, and the contractions of muscles. Nevertheless, he soon began to direct his attention to the overt movements, in other words, the visible movements of both the human and the animal body. In his studies of the human gait, he now attached an air-filled tambour to the soles of his subject's shoes, connecting them by a pneumatic tube to a graphic recording device held aloft by the pacing subject. Okay, he used a comparable set for recording the four-legged movements of the horse, and 2 years later he took on the much more difficult task of analyzing the flight of birds. The graphic technique which he had so successfully used for analyzing the movements of human beings and horses had to be modified to allow for the fact that the creature was airborne. And here's the device of the bird. The bird still had to be tethered by this extraordinary hydraulic tube which connected it to the graphic recording device. Well, by the 1870s, Méret was beginning to recognize the shortcoming of some of the techniques he'd so ingeniously created. The fact that the apparatus was forbiddingly cumbersome and that it often failed to detect some of the subtler variations in movement. One problem was that the geometrically graphic results, which consisted of wave patterns inscribed on paper, required expert reading and gave no impression of what the creature looked like as it engaged in its actions. He began to suspect that high-speed photography might be a satisfactory alternative, and that as long as the plates were sensitive enough to record a succession of rapid exposures, the camera might capture the continuity of a particular action with pictorial accuracy without having to use skeins of pneumatic tubing. The photographic technique to which he eventually committed himself was recognizably different from the one Muybridge exploited. In fact, 2 years before he became acquainted with the Californian results, he was already expressing interest in what his astronomical colleague, Pierre César Janssen, had achieved in recording the transit of Venus across the face of the Sun. Janssen described a photographic revolver fitted with a lens in the gun barrel. At the butt end of this device, there were 3 discs, the circumference of one of which was photosensitive, and the rotation of this disc was coordinated with a pair of slotted discs which allowed a section of the photographic disc to be briefly exposed to the incoming light at regular intervals, an arrangement, as I say, remarkably similar to the slotted discs employed by Plateau and Stampfer in the stroboscope and the phenakistoscope. When the plate was developed, it revealed an intermittent succession of stills around its circumference, and in 1876, Janssen published an article suggesting that this device would allow one to approach the interesting question of physiological mechanics related to the gait of various animal movements. Méret immediately recognized the possibility of such a setup, and although, as I've already pointed out, he was intrigued by what Muybridge had achieved, he was convinced that a photographic gun was technically preferable to the somewhat unreliable battery of cameras which Muybridge had employed earlier. In fact, by the time the English photographer was reveling in his Parisian acclaim, Méret had already begun to develop a portable counterpart to Janssen's device, light enough to be held in the hand so that it could be pointed at birds in flight. Instead of having to coordinate the exposure of 12 separate cameras, the accurately timed sequence was achieved with a single machine, Maire's gun. See? And that was what he aimed at birds. And he managed to get these rather remarkable pictures. In the early 1880s, Maire's work attracted the attention of the French military. Dismayed by the country's humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, it was suggested that the systematic study of human locomotion might make and play a significant role in designing exercise that would guarantee military fitness and endurance of the French soldier. In 1886, Maire resumed the photographic study of bird flight, which had previously defeated his technical ingenuity, and with the aid of cameras which represented a considerable improvement on the gun, he was at last able to represent the detailed trajectory of airborne movements and of other the birds and of animals. So in contrast to Muybridge, whose influence on art was largely confined to corrections of the pictorial representation of animal movement, Mary unknowingly laid the foundations of one of the most significant developments in 20th century pictorial modern art. And although it was not until some years after his death that this influence expressed itself in the dramatic appearance of so-called futurism. By the time Mary died in 1904, the understanding of the relationship, in fact, between space and time was undergoing significant transformation. In addition to the fact that the mechanization of transport and communication had already altered the subjective sense of distance and the traditional concepts of space and time, they had been extensively modified and reconstructed by physicists and mathematicians. And although it's unlikely that anyone in the artistic community was deeply acquainted with the details of non-Euclidean geometry, not to mention the mathematical subtleties of relativity, although it's often said that in fact Picasso and Braque were both introduced in evening sessions to the idea of Einstein's theory. There was a growing belief that the structure of visible reality was not quite what it seemed. For example, in the first 10 years of the 20th century, the pictorial representation of three-dimensional reality had undergone a somewhat disconcerting reconstruction, subverting as it did the traditional notion that picturing someone was inconceivable from anything other than a single point of view. Well, at about the same time, and I'm talking about Cubism, of course, at about the same time, so-called futurism was to do something comparable to the pictorial representation of actions as opposed to that of portraiture. And this is where Maire's enterprise proved to be so influential. Movements whose progressive continuity had traditionally been represented at one particular moment from which the observer could do no more than infer what had previously occurred, as I've already said, and what was about to happen, could now be dynamically represented in an overlapping succession of stills. In the many paintings which were undoubtedly inspired by Maire's laminated images, actions and events disclose themselves on a single frame, conspicuously unlike the sequence of individual stills which were so characteristic of Muybridge's work. Of all the futurists, I think that Giacomo Balla's work is most recognizably indebted to Maire's chronophotography. His dynamism of a dog, you see, these are Maire's things, that this woman walking this overlapping thing of the woman walking on the thing, and the woman with a little dog with now 40 or 50 legs. That couldn't have been done had not Maire introduced these overlapping images. The overlapping images, which actually would have been the picture that you got if persistence of vision was the explanation. Okay, so here we go. Dramatic though it was the painterly influence of Maire's. Dramatic though it was, the painterly influence of Maire's chronophotography was fairly short-lived. However, photographers have continued to exploit this type of imagery right up to the present day. And I think that the most systematic exponent of this idiom of overlapping images was Harold Edgerton, professor of electrical engineering at MIT. During the early 1930s, he developed and extended the stroboscopic principles which had prompted the 19th century chronophotography I already mentioned. Using high-speed electronic flashes, Edgerton was able to realize image in the same style as Maire, but with far greater accuracy and clarity. And that's Edgerton, and there's another one, bouncing ball, and then another one, which is the most famous picture of the stone dropping a milk puddle. Well, anyway, by the end of the 19th century, it had become increasingly apparent to Mairet and his colleagues that his research could be profitably applied to the growing demands of the industrial workspace, and that he might help to develop the most productive and at the same time the least wearisome use of the labourer's limited resources and personal energy. Well, from the enormous volume of his professional publications, not to mention the mechanical devices with which he recorded both internal and external events in the body, one gets the somewhat, I think, misleading impression that Mairet, unlike his somewhat simple-minded counterpart in the United States, is a major contributor to scientific knowledge. And yet, I think it's almost impossible to identify a single fundamental scientific principle which could be derived from his records and observations. To some extent, I think this was due to his reluctance to undertake experimental intrusions into the bodies of animals, let alone of that of human beings. He was convinced, without any theoretical confirmation, that vivisection interfered with biological function, apart from its immorality, and that to all intents and purposes it destroyed what the observer was trying to explain. But his failure to leave a significant scientific legacy is much more closely related, I think, to his somewhat naive commitment to the idea of what he mentioned of the body as a machine, that Lametrian approach. In fact, it's almost impossible to find any interesting references to, let alone explanation of, those aspects of bodily function which are peculiar to living organisms and the extent to which they differ from industrial machines. The contractile material from which muscles are made, the elaborate nervous circuitry by which their action is coordinated, and of course the distinctive energetic chemistry of muscles and nerves, which doesn't really develop until the 20th century. In that sense, I think it's interesting, to compare Mairet's scientifically unproductive work with the monumental legacy, amongst others, Sir Charles Sherrington, whose minutely detailed experimental work on what he referred to as the integrated action of the nervous system. I think the fact is that neither Mairet nor Muybridge addressed themselves to the perceptual problem even of apparent movement. None of them actually talked how the apparent movement was brought into, what the cognitive process was. And in the course of the discussions, which I hope will follow, I think we can reconsider some of the theories which have been offered to explain the subjective experience of continuous action, which results from the intermittent display of motionless imagery. Thank you very much.